Start this, mother.
Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series.
Welcome to Battle of the Network shows. This is a bonus episode. I'm Mike.
And I'm Rick. Hello, everyone.
And this week we're going to answer some mailbag questions.
Yeah, some questions and some comments. For this particular mailbag episode, we asked people specifically in our Facebook group, which is free and available for anybody to join. Just go to our Facebook page and you can see the instructions there. But I think we wanted to just give the people that have been with us in the group and our community a chance to give us some things to talk about. But you can always use our mailbag at battleofthenetworkshows.com email address, or just go to our page and leave a comment, webpage or Facebook page. If you have any questions, comments you'd like to address on a future bonus, or if you have, we always like requests for future episodes too. But today we're gonna dig in and address some things that people in the Facebook group brought up, and I'm really looking forward to this.
I am too. All right, and you have the questions in front of you, right?
I do. Yes, I do.
Okay.
Fortunately, I do.
I'll let you be the question reader.
All right. Okay. Well, let's start it off with John Hollum, one of our longtime listeners and friends, and I think he's been in the group quite from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
He has something interesting. It's kind of more of a general comment as much as something that we can, but I thought it'd be interesting discussion we could address. He asked, would you guys be willing to step outside of the 70s and 80s and maybe talk about some of your favorites from the 50s and 60s? And yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our people in our group and people that listen to the show, they don't just listen to stuff from the 70s and 80s. We focus on that era, but I think a lot of us enjoy other stuff as well.
Yeah, I think every now and then we could step out either into the past or maybe into the slight future of the show or era. It's funny because I originally read this question as him asking us to say shows from the 50s and 60s we'd like to talk about or that we like. And I was thinking, well, I know you have a larger knowledge of that era than I do, but I can say that I have been watching some shows again that I watched as a kid, of course, but enjoying some Flintstones and some Jetsons and some Gilligan's Island. And there are a few other shows that I certainly like from that era. Not that I dislike other ones, I just don't have as big a working knowledge.
Yeah, and
Perry Mason, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of read his question both ways, but I think we're kind of talking about a little bit now. But me personally, I think my all-time favorite television shows, they actually aren't in the 70s and 80s.
Mm.
They're more from earlier. I have more of a nostalgic affection actually for shows from the 50s and 60s that I watched when they were in reruns than the shows that I did when they were in first run when I was actually growing up in the Battle of the Network shows era. So for me, I mean, I can just rattle some of these off if anybody's interested. The Honeymooners is my all-time favorite TV show. I love Twilight Zone, Star Trek, Sergeant Bilko, Dick Van Dyke Show, Car 54, Where Are You? I've been watching a lot of that lately. And The Fugitive is one of my favorite dramas of those eras. And I think actually, if you put it to me, I'm a lot more forgiving of something from the 50s and maybe 60s, especially like the 1950s, and especially if it's black and white.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more likely to sit down and watch that and enjoy it no matter how good it is than something from even the 70s and 80s, although I love especially like stuff that I've never seen from the 70s and 80s. I love going back and watching that stuff too. So that's kind of where I stand. More of my favorite shows are actually from that era than from the era that we talk about on the podcast here.
Yeah, and you just listed a bunch of other good ones. I haven't really seen The Fugitive ever, and the Honeymooners. I think we've talked about that before. That wasn't really on where I lived, or on maybe at a time where I was watching TV or something. But there's definitely a missing gap there.
Yeah, that's really a rough childhood you had. Now I hadn't put this together now, but boy,
but
that's rough.
The ones I did, Leave It to Beaver. We can mention that, like that. I know you like Hazel.
Yes, I do like Hazel. Many people love Hazel.
Yeah, I haven't probably seen a lot of Hazel, but once you've seen any Hazel, you've seen a lot of Hazel, if you know what I
mean. I'm not sure I do know what you mean.
I don't either. I know I'd seen enough because I remember seeing who's the guy on there.
Don DeFore.
Yeah, Don DeFore, and he was the neighbor on Ozzie and Harriet.
Correct. Yes.
And I remember that because watching Ozzie and Harriet and him showing up on there, the way he would do the sitcom neighbor thing and just walk in the house.
Yeah.
And then he was on seeing him on Hazel, and like, oh, it's the guy who walked in the house. But I've seen a lot of those shows. It's just maybe they just didn't stick with me enough. I mean, I've seen Make Room for Daddy,
Well,
Father Knows Best, and you mentioned Bilko, which you turned me on to that.
mhm. I think too, like the way we grew up, and I've talked about this on the show. Like there was much more of a like common experience, like with me and my parents watching the shows that they liked as kids,
Hmm.
as opposed to you. It was kind of a different dynamic going on there. So
Yeah,
for me, a lot of these shows, like I was introduced to by my relatives, my
right.
uncle, like like Star Trek and Honeymooners and Twilight Zone, and so I kind of got an affection from them that way, and maybe watch those a little bit more than I would have like more contemporary shows because of that.
Yeah,
And I do think it's interesting. I think going forward, we could find ways, whether it be bonus episodes or so. If people are interested in us kind of going outside the era, either to the past or forward, let us know. We'd love to hear that. But there's ways that we can connect a lot of the TV from the 70s and 80s to the 50s and 60s.
hmm,
And there's kind of a natural thing going on there because a lot of times things in the 70s, especially, played off or followed directly from stuff in the 1950s. And I think a good example of that is Saturday Night Live, which a lot of those people on the original cast and the writers, they grew up watching stuff like Highway Patrol. That was like their frame of reference. So a lot of the stuff that they would be doing in the 1970s was playing on people's views of television that they watched in the 50s and 60s.
right.
And I think also there's a certain other high profile sketch comedy variety show, Mike, that we might be talking about in
Uh-huh. Yeah,
the near future and a future season. That also it was built on television and not just contemporary television, but television history. And a lot of the humor on that show was based on people responding to stuff that they had watched earlier.
yeah, yeah. I think it would be interesting, and there are definitely a number of '90s shows that I wouldn't mind talking about either. I don't know if I'd want to go much beyond that. I think then we're encroaching too much on the now,
Yeah.
even though we're 20 years into the 2000s.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if there's a remake or something.
Yeah.
And would this be a good time to mention what Gino, another
Yes.
longtime group member, said? We've had a long-running ongoing conversation about John Shuck for some reason in the group. And I think he mentioned that it would be interesting to compare a show with its sort of reboot or remake, and we sort of touched on that a little bit when we did a TBS episode. We mentioned the Leave It to Beaver revamp that they had on there,
Hmm.
but he specifically mentioned the Munsters Today
Right.
and comparing that to the Munsters, and I think that's a great idea.
And the Monsters Today was on in the 80s. Is that syndicated?
Yes, I think that was
Okay.
Munsters Today. It was syndicated and it's available on the NBC app, I think.
Oh,
So I think the whole run of that is available. So
oh
it's
wow.
accessible.
Is the regular Monsters still accessible?
I believe it is. I think it might
Okay.
be on Peacock, which, well, that might not be as accessible to everybody. But I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's on. I think that's on DVD, whereas the Munsters Today isn't. But
Right.
I think it's accessible enough that we could probably do a interesting episode looking at how that was different, maybe why it worked and didn't work, and then give us an
Yeah.
excuse to go back and look at a classic '60s show that people remember,
Yeah, I think so.
and a chance to do a show about John Shuck.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he did appear in Battle of the Network Stars, but yeah, an actual show where he's front and center. And then there's the Edward Herman TV movie, right?
Mm. Oh yeah, that's right.
That's in the 90s, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we have some good options. We've dropped a couple of pretty good teases or
Yep.
episode ideas for our next season. So, but the short answer is yes, we would be willing to, and we'll continue to look for ways to do it. But if that's the kind of thing that interests you, let us know.
Yeah. All right.
And well, before we step out of that time frame completely, though, maybe we should address Steve's question.
Mm.
Steve Cloutier, who we've talked about, member of the Illuminati Social Club podcast, and
Yes.
they did yeoman's work going through every episode of In Search of. Did a great job covering each episode, and we've mentioned him on the show here before. But he asked Dick York or Dick Sargent.
Well, I can't say I've watched enough Bewitched to have a really informed opinion, but I'm gonna say Darren 1.0, which is Dick York, right?
OG Darren is Dick York, yes.
Yes. And unfortunately for Dick York, my biggest memory of him at this point is seeing him over and over on teases for Weekend Entertainment Tonight.
Yes.
scandals and things, and where he's got an oxygen tank and stuff. And he's like, one day you're Dick York, and the next day you're nothing, or something like
Oh
that.
my gosh.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it would
Yes.
be like every weekend.
I yes, I share that vivid memory of that. You're totally on point with that. That is
Uh,
unfortunate because, well, Dick Sargent, he was actually on a TBS sitcom, and he had much more prolific acting career into the 70s and 80s than did Dick York because of, I guess Dick York's health problems. But personally, I agree with you. Like, I got to go with Dick York.
but
But
I think you said recently on an episode that it didn't matter which one that Darren was an idiot
yeah,
when we were on our Tucker's Witch episode.
right.
Yeah,
I never understood the entire psychology behind Bewitched, the show. Dick York didn't seem to really appreciate Samantha, and Dora didn't appreciate Darren, and Samantha didn't really do anything about it. So really, it was just a bunch of mismatched people acting in ways that I couldn't appreciate. So
right.
I wasn't a big fan of the show. But when I think Bewitched, I think Dick York is Darren for sure. I think we've definitively settled that one, right?
I think so.
Okay.
And there's
So
only one Larry Tate, right?
as far as I'm concerned, there is, yes.
Yeah. All right, then moving on.
Well, another great friend of the show here, Kevin Seymour.
Oh, yeah.
He asked if we could name our top five shows of the 70s and 80s, the
Okay.
decade. Now, that's kind of a big topic. We could probably go into depth more, but I thought, I thought maybe we could just list them and just give
Yeah.
like a list. For me, it would probably change depending on when I'm looking at it, but I think I could do that right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to go first, or I'll go
Sure.
first?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
And these are not in particular order, and these are just things that I thought of right now. My feeling. Cheers, and I think that would be number one. I think Magnum PI, and I'm going to say Search, and in
Wow.
fact, I think all of these are going to be things we've talked about.
I love it.
And Late Night with David Letterman, and I think this is right now, and I haven't seen enough yet, but based on my experience this season, Columbo,
Ooh,
I think is vaulted
that's great.
pretty high up. And some honorable mentions would be like Saint Elsewhere and The White Shadow, but there are things that and Newhart, but I don't know. Like Saint Elsewhere, I doubt I'll go back and watch
Hmm.
maybe ever,
Wow.
just because it's intense.
Right. That's very interesting, and I think it's hard for us to pick just five.
Yeah,
And I think that's good. I mean, it shows that if you didn't know it already, that we love the stuff that we're talking about here on the show. It's really cool that you picked Columbo, and I guess maybe that's kind of like the show that. Well, I guess maybe Search too, right? The show that kind of like the podcast has kind of led to you loving the show as much,
yeah. I mean, a Search predate. I mean, Search is one of the inspirations for the podcast,
right?
but yeah, Columbo for sure. I mean, like I said in our episode, I had some familiarity, but I hadn't really sat down and watched it.
Hmm. That's great. I mean, I love all those shows, and I think of the ones you mentioned, Magnum is the one I'm least familiar with. But I really enjoyed doing our episode on it, and it's something that I keep meaning to kind of like, hey, I should kind of go back and watch some more Magnum because there's so many cool things about it. But there's so much to watch, as you know. But really, I enjoy all those shows. And if you're ready for me to share my list,
And
mine is a little bit different than yours because it's sort of odd. But actually, three of the ones on my list we have not talked about yet. And it kind of goes to show you, I think, too, that we select the shows. We don't necessarily pick just, our favorites, or we try to do a broad variety each season and kind of get some favorites in with stuff maybe we're not as familiar with. But anyways, the first thing I thought of when I saw the question was Cheers. So I put that as mine too. Again, these aren't necessarily in order, but I figured Cheers has to be on there. Consistently good. You can tell, just go back and listen to the episode we did on it. You can tell how much we loved it, and of course, it dominated the baddies that year. So Cheers is one that holds up and I can watch anytime. Another one I put in that we've talked about is Love Boat. This might be kind of surprising. It may not be the best show. In some ways, is it a really good show? In some ways, you might even think, well, it's not that good a show at all. But to me, as I said before, it's the quintessential TV show, the way it does guest stars and everything like that. And I got to consider it one of my favorites now because I can pop in a DVD of that and just be surprised at like who the guest stars are, and I just get so much joy out of watching Love Boat that I'd probably have to consider it one of my favorites right now. Next, I put on, to represent pro wrestling, which I watched so much as a kid, I put down the Clash of Champions. This might be a little bit of a cheat because it's not a regular show, but it was a series of specials that was on TBS. And I think we mentioned this before, but either this or maybe the 605 wrestling show, NWA show that was on TBS on Saturdays. But Clash of Champions was really special to me because they were often primetime specials, but they were big events, and TBS treated them as such, they promoted them as such, and I would absolutely hate if I missed one of those. So to kind of get my love of wrestling in the 80s in there, I got to put on a little bit of a wrestling, and Clash of Champions is the one I put on there. Next one is It's Gary Shandling's show, which to me, just an unbelievable show. And even, I was watching it when it was on at the time, and I think it's something that we could very well take a look at on the show. We've talked about, covering at some point. One of the funniest shows of all time, and again, it's a TV show about TV, and I seem to be really drawn to that kind of thing. So it's a natural for me to really love that. And Gary Shandling's great. And I think the fifth one I put down would be The Odd Couple. Just one of my favorite shows, and I've talked before about my TV habits as a kid. Mentioned earlier, this was a show that my parents loved. Kind of got me onto. It was a show on WPIX and reruns all the time, and really grew to love it. And it's something that you don't always think of it as a 1970s show. I kind of think of it almost as a late 60s show, but it was, I think, 1970, 1974. And it's something that it's great comfort food. I can watch all the time. I love the characters so much that it's always entertaining to me. So that would be my list. Now, one thing I don't want to, I think I could put down Battle of the Network shows, which is great. Brady Bunch as a kid, it was one of my favorites.
Battle of the Network shows, really?
Oh, I'm sorry. I've done it again. This is another podcast tradition, is me mixing Battle of the Network stars. Battle of the Network shows is terrible. There's no way to put that on my top 5 list. Those guys don't know what they're talking about. One other thing I wanted to mention, which is kind of a debate for down the road maybe, I don't really consider this an 80s show, but it technically started in the 80s, would be The Simpsons. I'm assuming that you didn't consider that for the purposes of this list.
No, and I feel like it barely started in the 80s, right?
Yeah, to me that's a 90s show.
And it hit its stride in the early 90s.
Right.
And
so,
Seinfeld technically started in 89. But
yeah, I totally consider that a 90s show.
Yes.
Too. So yeah, those are favorites, and I might add to them or subtract. But you could hand me an episode of any one of those right now, and I'd sit down, enjoy it, and have a good time.
Yeah, that seems like a fitting list. I wouldn't pick all of those, but for various reasons. But I have been checking out the Love Boat channel on Pluto. I don't think I've watched an entire episode yet. I like checking in and seeing who's there and what's going on. No, I did watch. I watched the first Charo episode. I watched that entire episode, and twice now, because maybe they only have so many episodes at their disposal. But I've stumbled on this. It's at least showing on there as a 2-parter that has this amazing cast of Skip Stevenson and Jimmy Walker and Dick Van Patten and Walter Slezak and Boss Hogg. And they're and Pernell Roberts, and he's some writer looking for his nephew, and there's going to each island and looking for him, and I don't know. It's epic.
It had to be a 2-parter to contain that cast.
And it actually had some footage of they actually went to Aruba or somewhere and filmed on location. And so Skip Stevenson and Jimmy Walker and Connie Stevens are helping Pernell Roberts out with this quest, and Boss Hogg is somehow a nemesis. I don't know.
I'd like to think that if I was in trouble and needed somebody's help, Skip Stevenson would probably be one of the first celebrities to come to my assistance.
Well, yeah, he definitely he's doing more in what I saw, the genuine just Midwestern guy thing, with that minus some of the little bit of edge that he had his comedian persona.
Yes, I tell you, I can totally see. There's been kind of a proliferation lately of these 24/7 channels. You mentioned Pluto TV has a bunch of them, and just recently added Love Boat. Of all the shows to make as video and audio wallpaper, and just have on, that's got to be a great one. I can totally see doing something else and having that on the background, just checking in every now and then. Oh, hey, there's a scene with this, or Love Boat has got to be the perfect kind of show for that kind of deal.
I think so, yeah, and and then the music kicks in. They are playing the end credits with the music, so you get to enjoy the instrumental version, and then it goes right into the next episode.
I'm glad to hear that.
Get it again, yeah.
To check this out myself.
And like I said, for you, that definitely makes sense to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Thanks, Kevin, for asking. And I kind of like it because we've done some ranking of characters and things like that. But I think you and I, Mike, we don't necessarily sit down and come up and rank things in order.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say? We don't necessarily. It's kind of more difficult for us to look at things that way. We don't necessarily see the need to do that. and
Yeah.
prioritize and agonize over like three versus four. But it was cool, kind of cool to list these off, and people that maybe haven't listened to the show as much too can get kind of a feel for what kind of stuff we like.
And I think it's, to me, the older I've gotten, the harder it is to find to definitive favorites.
Yeah,
There are different things that you like about movies or TV shows or whatever, for different reasons. Like I like Star Wars for different reasons than I maybe like a Martin Scorsese movie or something.
yeah.
I don't know that I could ever call a Martin Scorsese movie my favorite movie.
Hmm.
I think Raging Bull is a great movie, but
Yeah.
is it really anyone's favorite movie?
It's the kind of thing that, yeah, always shows up on critics' lists, but
But if you're just going to sit down and watch a movie.
right. Yeah, I see
Yeah.
what you're saying there.
Yeah.
All right. Kevin also asked us something I thought we could maybe touch on here.
Uh-huh.
He said, would you consider doing an episode on a 70s, 80s movie that would have been also made into a series?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, at least the way I read how he wrote it is like, maybe would we actually talk about the movie? And I guess to talk about a series based on a movie, which is a something you still see, but in our 1980 episode, I mean, there were what, like 4 or 5 that season?
Right. Breaking Away, Private Benjamin,
Hmm.
Freebie and the Bean.
Freebie and the Bean, which we didn't even recognize at the time. Just the other one, the Chevy Chase Goldie Hawn
Foul Play.
Foul Play. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a really fascinating topic. And we're talking like a theatrical movie too, not
Yeah.
like a TV movie that was, basically a pilot. But yeah, I think that's something we could do. There's some pretty good candidates. It seems like a lot of the
Hmm.
ones that come to mind, as you alluded to, Mike, they didn't last very long as TV shows.
Right. Yeah. And I think we do have something kind of penciled in that would fit that. If we want to talk about the movie too, we can for next season. But there are a lot of those out there. To me, it's an odd thing. I don't know. Like, and so many of them get turned into sitcoms too,
Yeah,
which is just an odd transition.
I agree. But I do think it would be interesting to kind of look at, kind of what we did with what I just said about the 50s, 60s shows and their reboots or remakes,
Hmm. Yeah.
kind of compare what worked about the movie and what worked about the TV. I mean, I guess we did MASH.
Yeah.
Would be one we did, but we didn't talk about the movie a whole lot.
Right.
I think the show that I believe you're alluding to would be a much more interesting contrast to talk about
Yeah.
the TV show versus the movie. So I think that would be a good place to start. But Kevin and anybody else listening, if you have a specific idea for something, let us know.
Right.
We do have something I think probably we'll do very soon, but we're always open to ideas, and there's some pretty good ones now that I think about that are interesting possibilities out there. But yeah, I think that'd be a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on here, a pair of questions that I think are interesting that I think we could consider, Mike. This is from Jacob Musser, who's one of our fans. He's in the Facebook group, as we mentioned, and he's also happens to be a Elvis Presley tribute artist. Which you probably don't know about that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, he loves Elvis, and I know that Jacob loves a lot of the pop culture stuff that we talk about here. So I'm glad he contributed a couple of questions. And before I read what you asked us, let me just say my personal favorite Elvis song, probably "One Night." I think he did that on the comeback special and Elvis's rendition of "One Night." Very cool. So I think that's probably my favorite Elvis song if I had to pick one. He didn't ask that, but just I'm throwing that in there.
I'm going to be all artsy fartsy and say Mystery Train.
Ooh, interesting. Okay.
Because I don't know a ton of his music, but those Sun Sessions are great.
Yeah, which is interesting because I think your favorite Greil Marcus book is Jailhouse Rock.
Yeah, it's a
So it's kind of unexpected, but
weird. Yeah, you know what? Another one, Suspicious Minds. That's a great song.
yeah, it has a nice build.
Yeah.
I really liked a lot of the drama, even of like Elvis's later songs, and One Night is kind of like that too. But there's just sort of like the power in it is just sort of like even like the melodrama, and just how intense it is. And Suspicious Minds, yeah, that's a great one. I thought it was cool.
Written by Mac Davis, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think Mac wrote In the Ghetto too, right?
Yeah, or maybe
He didn't write. He didn't write while he was in the ghetto. He wrote the song called "In the Ghetto," I believe.
That makes sense.
So yeah, again, thanks for writing, Jacob. And he had a couple of interesting questions, Mike. And the first one he asked, he was curious what made you decide to get into podcasting. And I think maybe this is a good opportunity. I guess we haven't really gotten into this in a while. Probably is maybe just kind of like the origin of the podcast and everything. This might be a good opportunity to share it or reshare with people that may have heard it before. But yeah, what do you think?
I think it's a combination of things. One, just years of talking about pop culture nonsense, in conversation and emails and whatever. And then we started talking about some of these particular things like search, and we had talked about that low and brow commercial for
Mhm.
a very long
Yes,
time.
that's before we talked about it on the
Yes,
podcast. We talked about it for
right.
a long time, and I think we didn't duplicate anything either.
I don't think we did 'cause
we we had
there was some,
45 minutes of entirely new conversation about the Lowenbrock commercial on the
yeah.
podcast.
And just I think we were both listening to a lot of podcasts at that point. And there was a lot of joking around like, oh, that would make a cool podcast. That would make that. And probably maybe stuff going on in our lives, personal lives, where we needed to do something that made us happy.
Hmm.
Is that fair to say?
I think that's
So,
fair to say, yeah.
yeah.
And you and I had been friends, for a long time before that, so
Yeah.
it was kind of natural for us to collaborate, and it was cool to do something like a creative project that we could do together.
Right.
And I guess we were kind of, as far as like the podcasting boom, Mike, where would you say? So we started in what, 2016, I believe. I think
Yeah.
we'll be coming up on our fifth anniversary next year, I think,
Ah, wow.
which is exciting.
Because I'm trying to remember because we had recorded the first season like a year before we put it out. So,
Yeah, okay. I think we might
uh,
have. I think we actually debuted the podcast probably in 2016.
that seems right. Yeah. So,
I'm just trying to think because it seemed like we were maybe just before it became a cliche to say everybody had a podcast,
yeah.
but maybe it was maybe it was still peaking as far as like the podcast boom, right? With like Westwood One, companies like that kind of getting into it.
Yeah, it was kind of just before I think big companies were really getting into it, which is still going on, of course. But
Yeah.
yeah, and at that point, like I started listening to the Word Balloon podcast maybe in 2000, 2005, maybe. I'm
Wow.
not sure. It was before it was before I one of my moves. So, and that was early, and the Ricky Gervais when that was free when they were doing that.
Yep.
And but then I know 2009 was a year I started listening to a lot, and that seemed to be like when they were really taking, like a lot of the comedy ones were taking off, like WTF had been around for a little, things like that.
And I dare say that, as far as I know, our concept was pretty unique. I mean, there were other television podcasts, but I don't think anybody was doing like using one episode and drilling down into that as a way to talk about the entire series and kind of put it into perspective and everything. So I think we kind of, created a show that we would like to listen to, but we also created a show that would be interesting for us to make, and that hopefully we were putting an angle on something that nobody else was really doing. And I actually think really the whole 70s and 80s era of TV was a little bit underserved at the time because you were having like maybe people doing recap podcasts or podcasts on more recent shows or genre shows like that.
Yeah, the other, I think you had been exploring the idea of doing something for Culture Shark,
Hmm.
and so we had talked about that before too.
Right.
Like not necessarily that I would have been involved, figuring out some of the audio stuff.
Yeah, and I'm very thankful that you basically figured out all of the audio stuff, and you had a background with recording and sort of using audio and music and things like that, which
Yeah.
helped you figure out a lot of this stuff and get us going and offering good quality sound. I mean, you can criticize the content, which would be fall on some of the dumb stuff I say, probably, but as far as our audio quality, I think we're competitive with it. Everybody out there that I listen to.
I think we're doing okay.
Yeah.
So, and you said Jacob had another question,
He
right?
did, yes. Now this is one I'm not sure how you feel about approaching this one. I think we
Hmm.
can answer it, but well, I'll just read the question first.
Hmm.
He asks, "What show that is not currently available on DVD or streaming would you most like to do an episode on?" And the reason I kind of qualified a little bit there was I think if I've got a whole list of stuff.
Right.
I don't want to give away too many things. We can name a few shows for sure, and maybe people could say, if they're particularly interested in one.
Yeah.
I have one like probably number one answer, and then maybe a list of like a handful of others I'd love to do. But
Right.
because some of these they're
And some
not.
of them are available to purchase, but like I think Night Court again is available to purchase again.
Yes, I mean that's
But
on DVD. I would
oh
consider.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I guess I was looking at things that didn't have an official release of any kind.
So all I can think of are two, I guess, both the American and Japanese Spider-Man.
Yep, that was my number one actually. I don't know why that. Well, I guess I can think of why, but I'd love to see the 1970s CBS live action Spider-Man series.
Yeah.
I'd love to do an episode on that. Those episodes are floating around; they're available, but they've never gotten an official. Well, actually, I think there a couple of episodes might have been released on VHS years ago,
Hmm.
but they're not on DVD and they're not available on streaming.
Right. And any other ones you have?
Fernwood Tonight,
Hmm.
I think one of the best underrated shows, kind of a talk show parody. Another one I love is It's Your Move. I don't know if I mentioned that in the podcast, but mid 1980s Jason Bateman sitcom that was absolutely great for the first half, got watered down a little bit, but I think that'd be great. And I'd love to see it on DVD. Another one is the 1982, I think in 1982, right? The 1982 Hulk cartoon series.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And kind of going along with that, like the 1970s Fantastic Four.
Oh yeah,
Those are ones I just love to see personally, and I think we could have a lot of fun talking about those. We'd love doing the Spider Woman episode so much, and
yeah.
I think those would be naturals for us. One more I'll mention. There's a couple more that I'm going to save because I think we might actually be able to do them at some point. And one is I'd like to mention This Week in Baseball. Uh, it got like a one like release of like a what they called a season from official release from Major League Baseball, and I thought there were going to be a whole bunch of them coming out, and that was the only one they've released so far, and I have no idea what they're doing with it. But it was so much fun going back and watching, episodes and seeing like with Mel Allen's commentary, and that was the syndicated 30-minute
Yeah.
look at baseball before baseball was all over the place, before you had ESPN Sports Center and things like that. So
Well, let me ask you this: Did it did it air in places in like regular time slots? Because I swear I only remember seeing it during rain delays.
I believe it did, but I also think it was used as filler.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
probably a little bit of both. I think stations did schedule it, but I think it would also get preempted a lot. So it
Yeah.
might appear like if they would put it at noon, maybe it would be the same station that might show like your local team's baseball, and maybe they would preempt it if there was a baseball game. So it might appear like, well, they're only showing this because there's a rain delay, but maybe it's that well they just bumped it around a lot because they would actually be showing sports.
To go along with that, the baseball bunch.
Yep. Oh yeah, yeah. Which actually is interesting, Mike.
Researching that.
I was doing a look, and some episodes may have popped up recently,
Hmm.
and they may be full episodes. So,
Interesting. Okay.
but I think that's a great question. I think it's funny that you and I had the same like number one choice.
Yeah.
Either one, both would be great, but
Yes.
I'd settle for the American version for now. And there's a couple more that I'd have on my list that I'd love to see get DVD releases or fuller DVD releases, but I'm going to save those because I think we want to talk to Mike about those, maybe doing one of these in the future. So, but
Okay.
yeah, great questions.
Yep.
So let's move on to another comment. Okay, getting back to another one that John had.
Uh-huh.
He suggested we touch on binge watching versus one episode at a time. What are the pros and cons of that? And I guess,
Yeah.
probably curious as to what we prefer.
I probably do more of the binging than you do. Although I feel like I do it in moderation, in the sense I'm not one of those people who would ever watch like an entire season of something in one day. I don't think, unless it's like maybe 8 episodes of a sitcom. If
Right.
that's only like a 4 hour commitment. And I certainly would make time to eat and go to the bathroom and all
That's
those
a
kinds of
relief.
things.
Good to know.
Yeah, in more than one way. And I feel like with the kind of shows we do on the podcast, I'm less likely to do that though, just because of the nature of how TV worked then. I feel like serialized things draw you into that more in general than a more episodic show. Like a more episodic show, I'm happy to even like skip around, do that. Now, on the other hand, I really enjoy the fact that like The Mandalorian comes out once a week. I feel like that's part of the experience of it right
Yeah, I'm surprisingly like really into that model. It seems refreshing in a way, doesn't
now. And there are other shows like that, like that I'm still watching that I watch them. The week I'm not waiting for the season to end so I can watch them all or something.
it? Yeah.
So if it's like a HBO show or Fargo just ended its most recent season, I was watching that week to week, and it's kind of nice. And now I went back and watched the first season of The Mandalorian again before this season. Did that over a couple of days. I know it was just as enjoyable, but I like this initial watching it and having a week to sit with it and listen or ignore everyone's theories.
Right.
But those are my films.
In an earlier, I guess one of our earlier mailbag questions, when we were talking about that, you mentioned as the older you get, it's tougher to come up with lists of favorites, or you're less inclined to rank things in that way. For me, kind of like I find the older I get, it's more like I get more anxiety about, hey, there's so much stuff I still want to see. There's stuff that I want to revisit, stuff that I want to see, and there's not enough time to watch it all. So for me, and I think I'm just generally like this anyway, I'd rather just kind of sample a lot of different things rather than totally plow through something. And one thing too is a lot of the stuff we cover on the podcast is stuff that we have already seen. There's some things that we're kind of rediscovering or watching for the first time, like say Tucker's Witch or something like that. But on the other hand, if we talk about what's happening, I watched probably all those episodes back in the day when I was younger. So I don't necessarily feel the need to sit down and watch a bunch of those unless it's maybe preparing for something like the podcast, or if I really get into it and I think, wow, I missed something here. I love this show more than ever. But in general, I think it's just kind of my personality. I'd rather kind of watch a bunch of different things and spread them out rather than sit down and watch a bunch of them. And that applies even to sort of, shall we say, unsophisticated shows like like a Love Boat or something like that. Even then, I still find it's more effective to me if I space them out a little bit and maybe just kind of get more of a smorgasbord of television rather than just diving in and plowing through something. Unfortunately, like a lot of times nowadays with new television, I feel like the way maybe Netflix drops a show or something like that, you're almost bullied into having to binge watch it because if a lot of shows get out and the quote unquote dialogue about the show, if you don't watch the whole thing in a short period of time, you risk falling behind, or worse, you risk having the whole thing spoiled for you. That's one good thing about kind of doing what we do here and going back 70s and 80s TV. You can get spoiled pretty easily, or maybe you already even know what happened in a lot of it, but it doesn't really matter as much. And to me, it's just a lot more comfortable just sitting back and watching it in my own pace. So, but I understand a lot of people, they love to just sit down and go through everything, and hey, that's fine. I don't have anything against that, but for me personally, that's just not generally my style.
Yeah, and I'm looking at my shelf of DVDs right now and wondering how many of these things I'll ever watch again.
Oh, yeah, that's a
It's
sobering
like,
thought.
and there are a lot of things that I kind of did binge through, or watched a couple times, but am I ever going to watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer again?
Hmm.
I don't know. Or Lost?
Well, I kind of
Or
had
if
that.
I do, I'll probably just stream them instead.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. Yeah, but I do kind of have that collector mentality, though. That whereas even if I'm not going to watch all of it, I like having it, and it makes me feel good to have it.
Hmm.
It's just interesting. I think what I'll do is not so much binge watch, but I'll put a couple of shows in the rotation, and then once I get kind of momentum into it, like right now, there's a couple of older shows that I'm watching pretty regularly. But instead of watching like 4 or 5 of them, I'll watch, I'll kind of go back and forth between them and spread them out that way. And then maybe once I get to like towards the end of the season, I'm like, oh, might as well finish this off, and maybe I'll do that. But just in general, I'm not so much inclined to the binge watching.
All right.
That was pretty good. Okay, let's see. Next up, we have friend of the show, Lori. And here's an interesting question, Mike. She asks, you have met Genius Award winner Robert Pine. Who else tops your wish list of BOTNS era celebs? So I guess, like, who would we most like to meet now that we've met Robert Pine?
Yeah, I think any and all the triumvirate of brunettes, right?
Yes.
Yes.
No,
Uh,
yes, of course. Of course. So they're fine actresses, and
yes, Linda Carter and Aaron Gray and Connie Zellick.
yes, of course.
And I think I said on our Buck Rogers, I blew the chance to meet Aaron Gray once at a comic thing. Regret that. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to think who else. The Jimmy Vivino guy from the Lowenbrow commercial. I don't know who he is, but
uh, that would be a dream get. Yes.
clearly we don't care about meeting Larry Wilcox.
Well, I wouldn't say it like that.
Yeah, we didn't take the opportunity. Let's say that
We
we
didn't
had.
know, but
No.
he's great. But that part of that might have been he was overshadowed by Robert Pine at the time. In
Yes.
fairness.
You know who? I think Greg Evigan would be pretty cool.
Oh, that's excellent. Just to pick his brain about Year at the Top.
Yes. Or Paul Schaefer. I would gladly
Oh,
meet
Paul
Paul
Schaefer
Schaefer.
would be as far as like no, you can look at this a couple different ways. Like who would you just like to go and get their autograph, or
Yeah.
maybe who would you like to interview on the podcast, or who would you like to sit down and have dinner with? And boy, Paul Schaefer would be just great to hang out with.
Yeah.
I'll tell you who the first one that came to my mind is and I've actually got three. First is Marjo.
Yes.
I mean the great Marjo Gordon. Just seems like a fascinating guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess he's not in the public eye right now, but
Right.
it'd be great just to get like a Marjo autograph. He's somebody that I probably would actually go out of my way to do that for.
Yeah.
Another one is Bob Uecker, Mr. Baseball.
Uh-huh.
The guy's totally hilarious. Seems like just a great, fun guy to be around. And for me, as a baseball fan, there's the whole aspect of him being a play-by-play guy for so many years, and his experiences on Mr. Belvedere alone is just something that we could talk about. Just a frequent guest on the Tonight Show. I heard an interview. I heard him on the Carson Show podcast, and he was actually a very good guest. It was one of the rare times that he wasn't in character. But in character, out of
Uh-huh.
character, I think Bob Uecker would be a very great guy to meet, and just somebody I think is one of the great celebrities of our era. And the third one that came to mind is Another great, Paul Williams.
Yeah.
Kind of a favorite, and you and I have talked about some of his appearances. He talks admirably so about gratitude. It seems like he's got his life together. He's very interesting. It also just seems like such a great sport. He goes and he sings with people. He writes songs with people. Just seems like a fascinating guy to meet, and he just figures in so much of this stuff that we talk about, and such a big, really kind of icon of especially the 1970s. So he would definitely make my list as well. Love to go get Paul Williams' autograph.
Yeah, there's a good list there. While you were talking, I thought of someone else, but I can't remember who it was now. So it may have been someone that it would involve time travel. So
Okay. Yes, I should mention that I restricted myself to people that are alive.
yes, yeah, yeah, I did too. But certainly, yeah, Ed McMahon if you were alive. Oh, that's who I thought. Alf.
Oh, yes. There's the guy who's done it all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a good one. Yeah. Well, I've got one more in front of me here, and this is also from Lori, and this might be a good one to close out this mailbag episode with, because it's an interesting question. She says BOTNS is on my list of must listen podcasts, and of course I had to read that part, right? She says, what are some other podcast faves of ours? So, what kind of podcast do we really like to listen to? Boy, I'll tell you something. I have an app, and I have tons of podcasts that I subscribe to, and it's a struggle for me to keep up with them. But I think I'll try to narrow it down to to a manageable number here.
well, I'm in because of the time we're in. I've been listening to fewer, unfortunately, but I can mention a few that I check in with, and some we've mentioned on the show before. Certainly, 20th Century Pop and Menage a Pop from friend of the show Tim, and always encourage people to go check that out.
Especially the episodes of Menage a Pop that you and I were on separately.
Yes, yeah. Actually, there's he did one with a guy who has a G.I. Joe podcast, and those are really good episodes. He talked about Superman the movie, the G.I. Joe comics mostly, and Bruce Springsteen. So I was definitely a sucker for that week.
Yeah, I thought you would enjoy those episodes. I meant to make sure you'd see
And
those.
I want to check out that guy's podcast. A Beatles podcast we both listen to called Things We Said Today, and Word Balloon, which I've mentioned. I don't always listen to that, but when it's someone I'm interested in, I will definitely check that out. And he's been doing a lot of YouTube content too, so he's expanded his reach, I guess. In a more sort of serious one is a public radio one called On the Media. It's actually, I mean, it's a radio show that I listen to in podcast form, but they sort of look at what's going on and look at it through the lens of how the media is covering things, and sometimes often take the media to task for how they're covering things, but also people in the media. And they do have a slant for sure, but they're open about that. And they have a kind of sense of humor about the show, or to the show too. So those would be some that I'm listening to. I would also say that I'm not listening to as much music, and I want to but it's been a good year for music for that I like. So a bunch of things, and I'm not listening to as much as I want to. But one of my favorite artists, Scott McCoy, has put out a bunch of stuff on Bandcamp, solo stuff, and also as part of a band called the No Ones with Peter Buck and some Norwegians, and a Young Fresh Fellows album, and a friend and colleague of his music name is the Junior League, has put out a couple things also on Bandcamp. And then there's a new Springsteen album and a Wildflowers set from Tom Petty that's amazing. And Mike Campbell from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers has a band called the Dirty Knobs, and they just put out a pretty cool album. So here's what I have to say.
Very nice, very nice.
And just say that Bandcamp is a pretty cool place to get music from independent artists.
I want to echo your shout out to friend of the show Tim, and also mention friend of the show Steve and his Illuminati Social Club podcast and the work they did on In Search of, which they actually got through the entire series. So they're not doing In Search of right now, but go back and listen to those. It was great the way they handled that the entire series. I really enjoyed those, and I'm catching up. I'm going through the series and listening to those, but I always enjoyed that. And yes, 20th Century Pop and Menage a Pop are great shows that I listen to. Talking about some TV podcasts, there's a few that I've just discovered in the last year, so I've got a lot of catching up to do on those. But there's a really cool one called Forgotten TV. Does a lot of research and kind of explores some more obscure shows and uses a lot of audio. He does a really good job producing it, and I very much recommend that. And another one I recently discovered is called TV Tangents. And in some ways, they're kind of like us, Mike. I think they talk about one particular show or topic. They're two, I think, longtime friends. They happen to be women, so you get like a female perspective and kind of where they're looking at, and they don't take themselves too seriously. And it really, I think one thing that I want people to feel like is that our podcast is kind of a community, and that I hope they get the friendship that we have, I hope comes through, and that the friendship that they have on TV Tangent really comes through, and you can tell that they enjoy doing it, and it's a lot of fun. So I really like going back and listening to some of those, and kind of keeping up with what they're doing now. Still listen to a lot of pro wrestling podcasts, especially classic wrestling podcasts, because I'm not really interested in the current product, but some of the stuff on the Arcadian Vanguard network. People know that, like Stick to Wrestling, Breaking Kayfabe. Those are weekly podcasts I like to listen to. One of my favorites is Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal podcast. Gilbert Gottfried and Frank Santopadre do a great job going into. A lot of times it's kind of older than our time frame, but like 50s and 60s pop culture, even older, like classic 30s and 40s stuff. They get great guests and always have entertaining conversations. I love that one. And Stuck in the 80s is another one of my favorites. That one's been going on for a long, long time, and they do a great job pretty much every week picking a different topic of 1980s pop culture and going into that. And again, they've got a great chemistry, and you can tell they have a lot of fun doing it. It really comes across on the podcast and really helps it out. And yeah, I think those are some of my favorites that I'd name. There's so many more, and one that I want to mention right now, as far as like if people are interested in another TV podcast, one I want to recommend is Zach to the Future with Mark Paul Golisar, and his co-host is somebody who's involved with the current reboot that's on Peacock. They're going through every episode of Saved by the Bell one at a time, and I almost scoffed at that idea at first, and I was never a big fan of the show, although I watched it. But they do an excellent job in kind of breaking it down and having guests on and everything, and it's really done. It's well done and has kind of just the right amount of reverence and irreverence for the source material. So I'd recommend that one too.
Does it make you want to go back and watch some of it?
It does. It actually, it's funny because I kind of debated whether would it be better to watch the episode first and then know what they're talking about, because that's what I do normally with that kind of if I'm going through episode by episode.
Yeah.
But actually I think it's almost better to listen to it first, because then when you watch the show you get more out of it. Because let's face it, Saved by the Bell there's not necessarily a lot of layers in there unless you're kind of going in there looking at them. It's more entertaining to actually watch the show, I think, when you hear like little tidbits about what might have been going on at the time, or how they did a scene or something like that. Or even just to kind of laugh at like, well, this flew in 1989, barely, but it would never go over now. It does make it more enjoyable. I wouldn't be watching Saved by the Bell if not for the podcast.
Right, that's what worries me about this podcast.
That'll make you want to watch Saved by the Bell?
Yes.
That is a threat.
That, and the reboot's getting a lot of positive reviews, and I'm kind of thankful I don't have easy access to Peacock right now.
Right.
I might be checking it out, but yeah. Oh, that's a cool list, and I need to check out a few of those.
I mentioned it before, but yeah, the Carson podcast with Mark Malkoff, he's been doing that for years. He sits down with one guest who has a relationship to the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and it's a incredible archive he's got of guests, not just guests who are on the show, but people who are behind the scenes, people that worked on it, staffers, people with the network executives. He puts so much work into that, and it's really like this great ongoing history of one of the longest running and most famous TV shows in history. So that's always a treat to listen to, and want to give that a shout, because that's another one of my favorite podcasts.
I think that was a good way to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Those are good questions.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Yeah.
We're always happy to answer questions, and we love having the conversation on our Facebook page and our social media. But I think at some point we'll do another mailbag episode or two in the future.
Yeah, and if you join the Facebook group, you'll also should have the chance to vote for a couple Betty Awards.
That's an excellent point. We've kind of developed a tradition of having the listeners participate in the baddies and help determine. So yeah, you definitely want to be involved in that.
And the outcomes are not always what you expect.
Certainly not.
Okay, let's close that mailbag and head off into the sunset.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network Shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows, and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Battle of the Network Shows.